He smirked as soon as he saw her. Officer Brent Maddox, barely a year out of academy, strolled into the courtroom with the swagger of someone who thought the badge gave him gravity. His uniform was freshly pressed, his boots shined, and the look in his eyes said he was here to perform, not testify. As he crossed the aisle, his gaze landed on a black woman seated quietly in the front row, poised, composed, hands folded neatly over a small leather notebook. He leaned toward another officer beside him and whispered with a smirk, "Looks like the court's bringing in interns now." The other cop chuckled under his breath. Brent didn't stop there. Either that or someone's paralegal wandered into the wrong courtroom. The woman didn't react. She didn't glance up or correct him. She simply turned a page in her notebook and continued reviewing the file in her lap. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was deliberate, practiced, the kind that comes from years of watching men like him collapse under their own ignorance. But Brent didn't notice. He was too busy looking around the courtroom like it was a stage made for him. He leaned back on the bench, legs spread just wide enough to announce his presence, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Let's get this show on the road," he muttered, glancing at the clock. "I've got better places to be." He glanced at the woman again, half expecting her to fetch water or carry a file. Instead, she closed her notebook calmly, stood, and began walking toward the bench at the front of the courtroom. He blinked, confused, until the bailiff's voice cut through the murmuring room. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Raven Sinclair, now presiding. The woman stepped behind the bench, and Officer Maddox? He stopped, smirking. The room rose slowly, like it was catching up to the moment. Brent didn't move at first. His body froze halfway between a smirk and confusion, the breath stuck somewhere between a scoff and a swallow. Judge Sinclair took her seat with the grace of someone who had done it 1,000 times, not rushed, not hesitant, just precise. She adjusted her robes, folded her hands on the bench, and nodded to the clerk. "You may be seated." The shuffle of bodies echoed as everyone sat. But Brent stayed standing a second too long, as if trying to decide whether it was some kind of joke. The same woman he had mocked not 2 minutes ago, quiet, unbothered, invisible to him, was now seated behind the gavel, calmly reviewing the docket. The same eyes he thought were beneath him were now the ones deciding how this day would go. He sat down slowly, jaw tight, trying not to glance around but feeling every stare as they landed on him. The courtroom energy had shifted, not with sound, but with stillness. Brent could feel it in the back of his neck, the slow crawl of recognition from the gallery, the awareness settling in the room like fog after heat. Judge Sinclair flipped a page on the docket. Her tone remained measured, almost indifferent. "We'll begin with the preliminary hearing for Case 0725B, State v. Turner. Officer Brent Maddox, you're listed as the primary witness." Brent cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." The title came out stiff, unnatural, like he had never imagined he'd be forced to say it to someone like her. Judge Sinclair didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She didn't meet his discomfort with her own. She simply looked down at the case file, her brow furrowing slightly, not in anger, but in attention. "Before we proceed," she said, eyes still on the file, "I'd like to confirm something with the clerk." She leaned in, whispered something, and the clerk nodded. A brief exchange, nothing dramatic, but it made Brent nervous. He shifted in his chair, adjusting his collar like it suddenly didn't fit right. And still, she hadn't looked at him directly. That was what unsettled him most. He didn't realize it yet, but the show was over, and the lesson, it had just begun. Brent sat straighter, trying to pull himself back into the image of authority. He cleared his throat again, this time louder, as if sound could compensate for the heat rising beneath his collar. Judge Sinclair didn't acknowledge him. She continued flipping through the file, making quiet notes, her pen gliding steadily across the page. When she finally looked up, it wasn't at him. It was toward the defense. "Mr. Lawson, I understand your client is pleading not guilty. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," the defense attorney replied, his voice confident but laced with curiosity. He, too, had seen Brent's earlier behavior. "We're also prepared to submit video evidence contradicting Officer Maddox's report." Brent's spine stiffened. "Your Honor, I'd like to object to that." Judge Sinclair's eyes flicked to him, sharp and surgical. "You'd like to do what?" she asked, not cold, not loud, but with the exact weight required to freeze him mid-sentence. Brent blinked. "Object. I mean, the video wasn't submitted in discovery." The courtroom held its breath. Judge Sinclair leaned forward, her fingers interlaced. "Officer Maddox, you are not counsel in this case. If you'd like to speak, do so through appropriate procedure. Otherwise, remain silent until called." The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. "Yes, Your Honor," Brent mumbled, jaw locked. She returned to the file as though the interruption had never occurred. "Mr. Lawson, we'll review the footage shortly. Until then, Officer Maddox will remain in the courtroom as a testifying witness, not as a commentator." A few glances passed through the gallery. The clerk shifted behind her desk. Even the bailiff exhaled slowly, like this wasn't the first time someone needed reminding of who held the gavel. Brent sat back, arms folded tightly across his chest, his badge suddenly feeling smaller on his chest. He glanced toward the jury box even though it was empty. Anywhere but at her. Judge Sinclair didn't raise her voice. She didn't assert dominance. She simply did what he had failed to do. She respected the room. By the time the clerk cued the video for review, the courtroom had settled into an unnerving quiet. Judge Sinclair sat still as the screen flickered to life, her face unreadable. Brent, on the other hand, leaned forward slightly, trying to get ahead of the footage, already preparing to explain it away. But nothing could prepare him for what came next. The video was shaky, taken from a civilian phone. A teenager standing on a quiet street corner. Brent's voice off-screen, sharp, confrontational. "What are you doing out here? You matching a description?" The kid's voice was barely audible. "I'm just walking home." Then came the part that shifted the room. "I asked you a question, boy. Don't give me attitude." There was no provocation, no resistance, just the quiet stillness of someone trying to survive a moment. Brent's voice again, louder this time. "Hands where I can see them, now." The courtroom seemed to shrink with every word. No context Brent could offer would change what they'd just heard. The video cut to static. When the lights rose, Judge Sinclair didn't react. She didn't sigh. She didn't look angry. That was what made it worse. She glanced toward the clerk. "Would you please confirm the date of that incident?" The clerk checked the file. 14 days ago, Your Honor." Judge Sinclair turned to Brent now, directly, fully, for the first time since she took the bench. "That's not the case you're here for today," she said, her voice calm. "But the conduct shown in that video speaks to a larger pattern. Brent opened his mouth to object again. She held up one hand. "No one is above review, officer." "Maddox! Not even you!" The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The way they landed was enough to send a chill through the air. She turned her gaze to the gallery as if addressing every person in the room. "Let it be known for the record," she said quietly, "that this court sees not only the facts, but the behavior behind the badge." Brent sat back, stiff as stone, his pride cracking beneath the silence. What had begun as a routine day was unraveling, exposing not just his case, but his character. And Judge Sinclair? She still hadn't raised her voice once. The courtroom recessed for lunch, but no one left without tension hanging from their shoulders. Brent stayed seated a moment longer than everyone else, jaw tight, knuckles pressed white into his thighs. When the bailiff finally gestured toward him, he stood slowly, the stiff veneer of confidence now cracked and uneasy. Judge Sinclair would like a word. "Privately," the bailiff said. Brent followed him through the narrow hallway behind the courtroom, past framed portraits of retired judges and plaques engraved with names he'd never bothered to learn. When they reached the chambers, the bailiff opened the door but didn't follow him in. Judge Sinclair was already seated at her desk. No robe, just a dark navy blouse, sleeves rolled to her elbows, reading glasses in one hand, a file folder in the other. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. "Close the door behind you," she said without looking up. Brent obeyed. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat awkwardly, back straight but eyes unsure. There was a pause, long enough for him to feel the silence, long enough for him to wish he could walk back the last 2 hours of his life. Judge Sinclair finally looked up. "I reviewed your record this morning," she said, opening the file slowly. "Not just this case, all of them. Excessive stops, verbal aggression, 2 unofficial civilian complaints, and now a courtroom interruption. Do you want to explain?" "Any of that to me?" Brent swallowed. "I didn't know who you were," he said quietly. "And you thought that justified your behavior?" she asked, her tone measured. "You thought assuming I was someone beneath you made it acceptable to mock, to belittle, to ignore." His lips parted, but no words came. She closed the file gently. "I've dealt with your kind before, Officer Maddox. Not just as a judge, but as a black woman walking through the world. Men who think a uniform makes them untouchable. Men who confuse arrogance for authority." Brent shifted in his seat but didn't speak. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharper now. "You didn't just disrespect me. You disrespected this court, and the people you're sworn to protect. You forgot that justice is not a weapon, it's a responsibility." Brent looked down at his hands. He had nothing left to offer. Judge. Sinclair leaned back in her chair. "I'm not here to ruin your career," she said, "but I am here to remind you that if you wear that badge without humility, you're more dangerous than the criminals you claim to stop." The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full of everything he'd failed to see. "Dismissed," she said, already returning to her notes. Brent stood, hesitated at the door, then left without a word. The courtroom had refilled by the time. Brent stepped back in. Gone was the swagger in his stride, the crooked smile that once clung to his lips. His posture was still upright, but it was tighter now, more careful. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. Not the gallery, not the other officers, not even the defense attorney who had once flinched beneath his interruptions. Judge Sinclair entered. From the side door, robe back on, expression calm. The clerk called the court back into session. She gavelled once, gently, and looked directly at Brent for the first time since the chamber's meeting. "Before we resume the case proceedings," she began, "this court has reviewed new material relevant to Officer Maddox's testimony. I have made a formal request to the Oversight Committee to open an internal review of the officer's conduct, including, but not limited to, his recent field behavior and courtroom conduct." A ripple moved through the room. Some heads turned. A few mouths dropped open in quiet surprise. Brent sat still. He didn't protest. He didn't blink. "This is not a disciplinary hearing," Judge Sinclair continued, "but let it be stated for the record. Integrity is not a uniform. It is a practice. And in this courtroom it is expected by everyone. No outrage, no drama. Just facts." She moved on as if nothing had shifted, but the room no longer looked at Brent with respect. They looked at him with a kind of awareness he hadn't known how to fear before. The same crowd he once brushed off now saw him, fully, and the power he thought he held had shrunk to nothing more than a badge on a shirt too big for him to fill. "And Judge Sinclair?" she continued as though he were no more special than the next case on the docket. "Because that's what true justice looks like. It doesn't perform. It holds the room without demanding applause." By the end of the day, the courthouse halls buzzed, louder than usual, not with voices, but with vibration. Phones lighting up, notifications pinging. The moment had escaped the courtroom and was now pulsing across social media timelines like a slow-burn explosion. Someone had uploaded the civilian footage. The same video Judge Sinclair had quietly played in court, now viewed through thousands of lenses across the internet. A black teenager, unarmed, respectful, still. Brent's voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the silence like a blade. No context necessary. The truth didn't need help. It wasn't edited. It wasn't captioned. It didn't have to be. The clip spread within hours. "This is who's policing our streets." She never even raised her voice, and still dismantled. Him. Judge Raven Sinclair. Remember her name. By the time Maya, a court clerk, stepped into Judge Sinclair's office to deliver an updated docket, she paused. "Ma'am," she said gently, "you're all over the news." Judge Sinclair didn't look up from her file. "I figured as much." "Do you want to make a statement?" Maya asked. "No," she replied, flipping to the next page. The statement already made itself. She didn't smile. She didn't lean back. She just kept reading, like the courthouse wasn't swelling with reporters outside, like her name wasn't trending for all the right reasons. She hadn't planned it. She hadn't wanted attention. She'd simply done her job, with dignity, restraint, and undeniable truth. Outside, a reporter leaned into a microphone. "Sources say an internal review is now underway for Officer Brent Maddox's conduct, following a court hearing led by Judge Raven Sinclair." Brent watched it unfold from the passenger seat of his union rep's car, hands clasped in silence. His voice, once loud and unshakable, now haunted every screen around him. And Judge Sinclair? She didn't need a press conference. She'd already delivered the truth, gavel in hand, without ever raising her voice. That evening, long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines grew louder, Judge Raven Sinclair sat alone in her chambers. The lights were low, her heels off, her robe draped carefully over the back of the chair. On her desk sat a ceramic mug of tea gone cold and a folder of cases she couldn't bring herself to open. Not yet. Outside, the city pulsed with the noise of attention. She knew her name was being passed around online like a symbol. A warrior. A hero. A headline. But sitting in the stillness of her office, Raven didn't feel victorious. She felt tired. Because this wasn't the first time. It wasn't the first time someone in uniform had dismissed her before she spoke. It wasn't the first time she'd been mistaken for the help, or the intern, or the assistant. It wasn't the first time she'd watched a man perform power, not knowing she had carried more of it in a whisper than he ever could with a shout. She remembered the first courtroom she ever entered as a law clerk, how the bailiff asked her to wait outside for real counsel. She remembered the partner who had called her impressive for someone like you. The juror who muttered during voir dire didn't know they let affirmative action run courtrooms. Now, she never reacted, never snapped. She just remembered. And today, she remembered it again. She stood slowly, stretching her back, her spine aching not from age but from the weight of years spent sitting still so others could learn how wrong they were. She moved to the window and looked out over the darkening skyline. People were finally listening. But the real work? It wasn't viral. It was in showing up again tomorrow, and the day after that. Because justice wasn't just a moment. It was a lifetime of choosing to stay. The formal notice arrived by courier. The next morning, a sealed envelope addressed to the court. Brent Maddox had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. No badge, no gun, no patrol, just silence and accountability. Two things he'd never been forced to sit with until now. He didn't contest it, not publicly, not privately, because he knew. Somewhere between the viral footage and Judge Sinclair's eyes staring through him, the story he'd built around himself, invincible, untouchable, above reproach, had collapsed, and the weight of what remained was heavier than any uniform. Back inside the courthouse, the energy was different. Not louder, not busier. Just more awake. Staff nodded a little deeper when they passed Judge Sinclair. Clerks looked up quicker when she spoke, and the bailiff, who'd worked with her for years, stood a little straighter when she entered the room. Not out of fear, out of respect. That afternoon, she was called into the conference room by the chief judge and a few senior justices. The air inside was quiet. No press, no cameras, just a small velvet box resting on the table. "We don't usually do this," the chief judge said, clearing his throat. "But sometimes, someone needs to know they're not just seen when things go wrong. They're seen for standing right, when it's hardest." He slid the box forward. Inside, a medallion engraved with the seal of judicial excellence. She didn't smile. She didn't tear up. She just placed her hand over the box and nodded. "Thank you," she said. Nothing more, because it was never about the medal, or the moment, or the press outside waiting for a quote. It was about every time she walked into a room and had to remind people that her presence wasn't an accident. It was earned, and this time, they finally understood that. A week later, the headlines faded, replaced by newer scandals, fresher outrage, louder drama. But inside Courtroom 3B, Judge Raven Sinclair took her seat as she always had. Before the room filled, before the whispers started, before anyone had the chance to misread her again. The robe fit the same way. The gavel rested in her palm like it always had. And still, something had shifted. Not in her, but in the way people watched her now. Not waiting for her to prove herself. Just waiting to listen. The bailiff stood, taller. The clerk responded faster. Even the defendants, hardened by the system's weight, looked at her with a flicker of something she rarely saw before. Trust. She didn't need a medal for that. She didn't need a press release or a trending hashtag. She needed this. A courtroom where her voice didn't need to rise to be heard, where justice wasn't demanded, but embodied. Outside, spring had arrived early. The wind was warm. The trees along the courthouse walkway had started to bloom. Raven walked out that evening with her bag over her shoulder, heels clicking softly against the concrete, her breath slow, her spine steady. A young girl, no older than 12, stood with her, mother near the stairs, clutching a civics textbook against her chest. She looked up as Raven passed, eyes wide, and whispered, "Mom." "That's her." Raven paused. Not for attention, not for acknowledgement, just for the truth of that moment. She looked down, met the girl's gaze, and gave a small, knowing nod. Then, she turned and walked on. Not as a symbol, not as a judge, but as a woman who had once been mistaken for someone invisible, and chose, again and again, to stay visible anyway, because authority isn't something you wear, it's who you are when no one claps. She didn't shout, she didn't retaliate, she simply stood her ground and let the truth do the talking. Judge Raven Sinclair didn't just restore order to a courtroom. She reminded everyone watching what dignity looks like when it refuses to flinch. If you've ever been underestimated, misjudged, or spoken over, only to rise in silence and prove exactly who you are, this story was for you. Drop a like if you believe real power doesn't have to raise its voice. Share this if you've ever turned a moment of disrespect into a lifetime of respect. And follow us for more stories where quiet strength changes everything.